Hi, I'm Ilona Varo, and I am hosting the Thrive Through the Holidays podcast. I'm joined today here with Kristine Tye, and we're going to be talking about tips for parents as well as teens for how to get through all the holiday stress. Kristine, you're an expert of working with parents, coaching parents, specifically parents of teens. Could you also give us a little intro of who you are and what you do?
Yes, yeah. Well, thanks for having me, first of all. Yeah, I've got a private practice here in Sherman Oaks and also in West LA. And I half my practice is working with teenagers, and I've done parent coaching as well for about 13 years now. So I like working with the parent and teen kind of in terms of communication and figuring out agreements that work well as teenagers get older and kind of being the voice that bridges the gap between those generations, helping ease parents' stress and anxiety and encourage them to do what works for them and their boundaries as parents, and then helping teens feel empowered to influence their environment in a positive way, to work well with their parents. And a lot of times, parents and teenagers have the same goals of things working well, and then it's hard to be a collaborative team. So, helping them do that is a big part of what I do, in addition to just working with anxiety, OCD, trauma treatment, things like that for individuals. But yeah, love working with teens and helping parents be on the same page with their teenagers as much as possible.
Yeah. So you've been working with parents and teens for quite a bit, so I'm sure you've been through the holiday stress. What are some things that you see recur this time of year with your work with the parents of teens?
Yeah, similar to summer, just anytime there's a little bit of a change in schedule, I think, well, this happens otherwise, but definitely something is expectations that aren't really voiced. And it's just any shift in what the usual schedule is, even unintentionally, we kind of subconsciously expect somebody to be around when they're not, or someone to help out with one thing or another, or with teenagers, more time to relax or more time with friends, or sometimes even a specific thing they want to do with their family that they're expecting. And those being not voiced, or maybe not even noticed, or not even aware of in ourselves, if we have those expectations, that comes up a lot. um, and then parents expecting kind of some of the same traditions or things of years past to either be important or to not be important to their teen. So a lot of the time, what I'm doing is helping make sure there's some communication about some basic expectations of who's supposed to be where when, and how
Hmm.
much are we leaving space to sleep in or to participate in family activities, things like that. Just even noticing what some of those expectations are, and clarifying them.
Definitely. I don't know about you, but I've seen teens get just more and more busy to a degree where I'm just exhausted often, like hearing what their schedules are.
Mhm.
How do you guide parents through having the conversation around expectations? And also, independence comes up a lot too for
Mhm.
teenagers. They want to do their own thing, they want to be with their own friends, they don't necessarily want to do the family thing. If there's younger siblings that maybe the parents are wanting to hold on to the family
Mhm.
traditions, how do you encourage these conversations to be had?
Yeah, yeah. Well, kind of starting with curiosity as much as possible, um, getting ahead of any of the expectations. So having some conversations that are along the lines of, what are you looking forward to over your break or over the holidays, or what part of our family traditions are important to you, sharing the ones that are important to you as the parent, and asking them about it. Again, there might be a surprise if, I don't really care about doing this, but I really like doing that, getting to hear what's a priority for everybody ahead of time. So there can be those expectations. Sometimes that's hard to get ahead of, but doing that as much as possible. And then as far as what the expectations are, kind of clarifying whether it is an actual expectation, or whether it's more of sort of a request or a suggestion. It's helpful
Hmm.
in general with as things change so quickly, year to year with teenagers growing up, of, like you said, what is, them being independent or what decisions are theirs to make. But kind of helping check in with yourself as a parent of what really feels important to me as far as our time together as a family, or whatever it is. But so, for example, there might be, a party or something, or some sort of family event, and really knowing, is it, hey, I'd really like you to be a part of it. I'd really like you to be there. That's a way you can, do something for me or show me that you care, that we spend that time together, something that's important, that being a request. So giving the teenager that option, or if it's something that's really an expectation, like, okay, so this is our main family event. This is a thing I'm really expecting you to do. And, you need to be there. And, if need be, then there's some sort of privilege. Like, and then, the next day, go hang out with your friends. That's fine. So it's kind of earning that independence based on an expectation. Because the
Hmm.
thing about a real expectation is there sort of has to be a natural consequence if you really expect it, not just you have to do this or else, because then we get into sort of a power struggle,
Yeah.
just arguing or trying to convince you should do this or you should want to, whatever. So sometimes it feels at first a little bit like it comes across as a threat, to parents, especially if they're a little bit anxious, right? To hesitate of, I don't want to tell them they have to come to, this event or else. But
Hmm.
it actually helps with the independence for the teenager to make that decision for themselves of, okay, I see that this is just a request. I want to do it based on how they feel, but really is an expectation. Like if I'm joining in on this event, I get the things that I want as well. Like I get to continue to schedule all of my other days the rest of that week and hang out with friends.
Yeah.
So it's actually empowering to give a more clear boundary or expectation. And that's why it's important first for parents to check up really which is which. Like, do I really care about this thing over that thing? Or do I want to let them have that independent choice? Or if it is really important, everybody's here this morning or whatever it is, or everyone's joining in on this particular dinner, then framing that as an expectation with then privileges
What
earned.
age do you tend to see that happen where it's no longer maybe the parent making the decision anymore,
Yeah.
but it is more of a negotiation or an
Mhm.
agreement? What age is that typically appropriate to get into?
Yeah, good question. It depends on the family, and I think that's, definitely high school, but that's, like the 12, 13, 14 is kind of the middle age where as much as possible, I actually try to see it encourage parents to see it as a positive thing of giving them more options or choices. So then they get the feeling, a teenager gets the feeling of, oh, this is a way I get to contribute to the family by showing up in this way or contributing with my time or effort, whatever it is. But certainly, yeah, around that age, it's still much more appropriate to have more expectations.
And what about the teens that maybe don't want to meet the parents halfway? If there is really a struggle, it's not, I think we're kind of speaking in a perfect world sense that we could
Mhm.
have these kind of conversations and come to an agreement. But, what about the teen that just really is feeling defiant or not wanting to participate, not even wanting
Mhm.
to meet halfway, doesn't care about the consequences? How do you go about that?
Yeah, I mean, there's usually at that point, there's probably been a little bit of a dynamic where that's been happening. So sometimes it's a little bit of like it has to get harder before it gets easier in terms of really clarifying which thing is an expectation. Because often, if there is that defiance, then there probably has been some sort of convincing or unclear expectations in terms of the parent side, because they're probably trying to reason with their teenager, which is a good intention, but then often actually leads to more resistance, right? So if I'm trying to convince you to do the thing that I want, it actually puts you more in the position of convincing why you're right, right? So if they're already kind of in that power struggle, so really prioritizing depending on how bad it is or how, I don't want to say bad, but how much that resistance there is. Um, Starting with things like safety, like, there have to be rules, even though it's the break, you still need to be home by this time, whatever. And
Hmm.
really being clear on if it's a change, like you've had all of these privileges, but now that's based on those safety rules, and then being able to stick with those. Um, and then, as much as possible, offering positive experiences, making sure that you have a lot of influence over whether or not a teen feels invited to do something, even if they're not taking that invitation at first. It might take a little bit of time, but trying out a new tradition, trying out something that they're being invited to be included in, and then sticking with it, even if it's something that they resist at first. Because sometimes that also happens if parents are over functioning a little bit, trying to get them involved in this or that, trying to work with them, trying to get them to all their things, like trying to almost give a little bit too much, and then or they're expecting something back in return for driving them to this or doing all of those things, when in fact it's actually positioning it like you get all of those things without having to actually meet halfway.
Hmm.
So sometimes there's resistance at first in doing fewer of those things, or it feels like punishment, but it actually it's good to have a bit of a reset of like, okay, these are the things that I'm really expecting, and then we can be earning those things back.
Hmm. I think the topic of earning brings up a good conversation around social media.
Mm,
Teen use and social media, particularly around the holidays, there's going to be a lot of, I imagine, comparison that comes up and seeing their friends maybe go to parties that they weren't invited to, or what they get for Christmas, or how do you like to work with parents when they see that their children are kind of struggling with their relationship to social media, whether it's the keeping up or the
mhm.
comparison or feeling left out,
Yeah. Yeah, that's tough too because there's probably it's such a hard thing to manage. There's probably already a bit of a dynamic there with that too, of,
right?
parents trying to help them manage how much they're using it, and everybody has different rules on how much, the kids get to choose how much they use their phone or not. But again, I really try to lean with the angle of curiosity, and one of the phrases I use with parents is that you want to try to become, you are sort of the voice in their head. So you want to talk with them the way you want them to talk with themselves. So a way that that applies with social media is, how are you feeling seeing all of those things, or how are you feeling after you spend, an hour, however long, looking at that, or really helping them be curious about, okay, what's the result of this, putting two and two together. um, it's tricky because it's not trying to convince them, you don't want it to be a leading question of like,
Hmm.
that's a different conversation of, hey, I'm concerned that this isn't good for you.
Mm.
That is also fair to do, but it's trying to have both conversations, especially if you have a teenager that's sharing any of that with you. That's great. If they're venting a bit about it or coming to you as a parent with feeling left out or feeling upset about something, just hear them out, mirror the feeling of like, that makes sense that you feel annoyed about that or feel left out about it, and to really help them reflect and notice that you're seeing all of those things. You're only getting this little snippet of what's really happening. How is that feeling to you, that that's how you spent your morning or whatever, is looking at what everybody else is doing? I really, does some of that feel good? Does it not feel good? Do you feel more included? Do you feel less included? Kind of coaching them on how to reflect on that. And then again, it would be a separate time to have the conversation of, hey, I've been noticing how much you're on your phone and I'm concerned about it. How does it feel
Mhm.
to you?
Mhm.
Still having curiosity there, but be transparent about, I'm not sure exactly. I don't want to have to take it from you. I don't want to have to monitor that for you, but I'm considering it because it seems like it's hard for you to manage yourself. Being really transparent about it.
Mhm.
And then based on, ideally, especially like I said, if teenagers feeling comfortable sharing a lot of how it really does feel, or they're able to self-reflect, there might be a little resistance at first, but after a few of these conversations, maybe they'll be able to navigate some of it themselves, or parents can offer it more as help. Like, do you want me to help you manage this a bit? Do you want a reminder at this time? Or do you want to experiment with something like a time limit on your phone, or me taking your phone? Because it's trying to avoid as possible that being, a punishment, but something where parents can still be helping them set their own boundary.
Mhm.
But when it's not possible, when there's so much resistance, saying, I'm seeing how much this is causing conflict between us, it seems like it's making you unhappy, we are going to try implementing a time limit. And we'll revisit it after X amount of time and see how it's been feeling to you, how I feel about it. I think that helps a lot because there's usually resistance at first, like, being sort of a temporary experiment. But
Yeah.
so in other words, trying to approach with curiosity and collaboration, but then ultimately being willing to take on the responsibility as the parent of, if this is something I feel really strongly about, we're going to try having less time on your phone.
Yeah. Do you tend to see that parents get to that point typically with, let's say, the clients that are in your
Mhm.
practice, that parents do need to get to the point where there is a time limit? I mean, I know personally I put a time limit on my own social media.
Right, right.
I can't
Yeah.
imagine just like endless, constant. Of course, there's the urge and the desire, and it's fun, but then I don't know. I feel like sometimes it's unrealistic to expect a teenager to be able to track and check in with themselves. And even with a parent prompting, how does it make you feel? Like, I typically see a lot of resistance and just like, I don't know, I don't care, whatever, mom, like just that kind of
Absolutely.
dismissive. How would you approach that?
Yeah, I mean, well, usually this is kind of a reaction to, or I come into the picture when there's already been attempts to really over restrict, or times where there's absolutely no restriction whatsoever. So to sort of balance that back and forth.
Hmm.
Um, but to answer your question, yes, I think it really is, similar to how I say they're becoming their inner voice, being the parent that's doing that. You have to be the boundaries for your kid as well at first. Um, but the idea is to make it as much as possible not seem like a punishment. Sometimes parents are trying to be understanding and they wait for it to be like a punishment. You have a bad attitude about it. I think it's because of your phone, so we're punishing you around the phone. It's understandable. It's not that that's wrong. It's just that that's not as effective, or that usually creates some unnecessary power struggle or tension versus this is actually me doing the tough thing of what I think is better for you, the way that you and I might put a time limit on our phone as adults, because the parent is the adult trying to do that. So
Yeah.
I think more often than not, it's good to at least temporarily, maybe 6 months or so, having a, an agreement that you check in on together as a family that has a lot of um, not monitoring, but time restrictions that are based on parents. So then kids have an opportunity to reflect on how it affects them.
Yeah.
Have to have a
And I
break
think the
from it.
tough part is, I think the teens that don't have social media yet, I think that's just where parents should begin, is having those
Mhm.
conversations of, okay, we're going to start with X amount of time per day and we're going to check in
Yeah.
and we're going to really monitor and see how it affects you. And have it be a real conscious approach. But the tough part is the teenagers that have had access to social media and now the parents kind of want to walk it back a little bit. Is there any tips you would give for parents having those conversations? Because I mean, I love everything you're saying, but it's such like a therapist saying it, right?
Yeah,
Most
yeah.
parents are reactive or they get angry or they're just fed up or they're just so frustrated with the child's behavior. What are some tips that you would have for the parents to be able to stay very therapeutic and calm and neutral in expressing all of this?
Yeah, yeah. I think the best thing is as much as possible to be transparent with what you're feeling and to try to mirror back what your teenager's feeling. And try to empathize with, I get you feeling frustrated about this. Or I get that if something is a change from how you've been used to it being, that would feel annoying or frustrating or whatever it is that they're saying. And being able to empathize with that and then still sticking with whatever boundary feels appropriate.
Hmm. Yeah.
So that's where parents get lost, I think, in between with the best of intentions is trying to convince a teenager to agree to the boundary or limit. So when possible, it's great to collaborate and take their opinion into account. But ultimately, it has to be the parent saying, this is the experiment we're going to try. This is the rule we're going to set. This is how it's going to be, even if there's resistance.
Yeah.
So that's rather than trying to convince around the rule, just show the empathy for the feeling,
Yeah.
then the boundary is still there.
Yeah. And I think just, being a parent comes with distress tolerance. You're going to need to tolerate the discomfort you feel because your child is upset or
Mhm.
distressed or having a reaction to the rule or the adjustment. Would
Mhm.
you agree with that?
Absolutely. And I would still say, not to be, hey, this is really upsetting to me. Would you please not be on your phone? Not trying to convince, but to be transparent of, I'm really struggling with this as your parent because I'm seeing this behavior, I'm seeing that, or seeing whatever, and I want to be doing what's best. I don't know if this is the perfect answer, but I have to make the decision. So this is what I'm going to try. Or,
Yeah.
in a conversation of, this is part of why I think we need a break from the phone. Is it's so hard having this conversation, and I'm feeling so much distress, right?
Yeah.
Not so, in other words, the distress tolerance is also being able to model saying when you're distressed and then making a decision that is informed by that, as well as what you actually think the boundaries are.
Yeah.
Sometimes I think parents expect themselves to just stay cool, calm, and collected, which isn't the case. Like, as much as possible, act, not react. But don't expect yourself to feel completely chill about it all the time. If
Yeah.
anything, like I said, that's modeling of this is so frustrating to me. I need to try a change for a while and see how I feel after a bit because I
Yeah.
care so much about how you're feeling. I need to be responsible for this for you. So that's where this decision comes from, even if you don't like it.
Yeah, definitely. And as far as being a united front, let's say there's two parents,
Mhm.
whether married, divorced, living in the same house or not, do you think that that's an important thing for making sure that the messaging is parallel or similar
Yeah.
not conflicting rules at one person's house versus the other person's house.
Yeah, definitely. Whenever possible, I work with a lot of families that are separated, and it's very understandably. Sometimes there's a trying to balance if there's a little more leniency here, a little more strictness there, but that makes it harder because more often than not, the teenager in between, going back and forth, feels more of the negative effects of that rather than the benefits. It's different parents are going to have different personalities. It's good to have different parents,
Yeah.
but having different rules. You'll probably struggle with the downsides of the leniency and then struggle with the downsides of the strictness more so than getting the benefits. So, whenever possible, trying to be on the same page, being willing to stretch a little bit on either side in order to be on the same page with your co parent. Definitely, that's one that's easier said than done. We could do a whole
Yeah.
other
Of
conversation about that.
of
But
course.
I think sometimes, understandably, even subconsciously, as a parent, we try to balance out what the other parent is doing. But that actually creates more splitting. So
Mhm. Mhm.
having a rule that really respects everybody's boundary, that both parents can agree on as far as what
Yeah.
feels appropriate to them
Yeah.
is important.
So just to kind of recap, transparency, very important, making sure
Mhm.
that parents are sharing why they're sharing what they're saying, how they feel about what they're saying, empathizing with the child, understanding where they're coming from. I think another thing that we didn't really touch on is but not conflating. I think that that's kind of a mistake that parents make all the time because you did this, now I can't trust you to do X, Y, Z. I think a lot of times there's this jumping to conclusions, which I think creates more harm than not. Would you have
I think
anything
that's a
to add?
great point. Yeah, yeah. Sometimes I think that comes from parents trying to be reasonable, but how usually teens perceive that is I can't earn something back or I can't earn that trust. It feels like you're looking for a reason not to trust me, even though there's some logic to that, right? Of you said that you'd be home by this time, you weren't. So it's but as much as possible, having that be a rule ahead of time, not something that's as a punishment.
Yeah.
And I think more often than not really the rule is reasonable without that, meaning if there's a limit on your phone, that's not just because, oh, I can't trust you to not go on this app or the other app. It's sort of its own separate thing. If there's less time on the phone because of that, or there's some sort of agreement around what happens if there's an agreement broken that has to happen ahead of time, if they're doing something, if a teenager's doing something and then has a punishment they weren't aware of the consequence,
Oh, yeah.
then yeah, I think that that's like the conflating that you're talking about.
Yes.
So, but
Yes.
what I meant to say is that the rule of having limits is reasonable whether or not there's this trust. So parents sometimes wait to test it out and see if their kid messes up, which as a parent, usually the intention is I want to see how much they can handle, but or I'm not really sure if I feel like my rule is fair, but to the teenager it feels like being watched until you fail, like waiting to fail.
Yeah.
So it's just as reasonable to, this is the rule based on what I think is most healthy and safe for you.
Yeah.
Um, and that helps you have the space to make some mistakes, um, not always have to make the right choice because there's, conservative enough rule there as your parent.
So really communicating, we're trying to set you up to win.
Mhm.
And we're gonna probably stumble and fall and go forward and backwards a few times till we get it right. But the bottom line is we want you to succeed. And here's talking about expectations, being very transparent about them from the start rather than kind of coming up with consequences that feel like punishment after the fact.
Yeah.
I mean, that seems to be the theme, right? Like, talk about things beforehand,
Mhm.
reflect on maybe past years that things might have not gone the way you wanted them to go, use it as a reference point, but not as a rule or thinking that that's what you're going to get this year as well. We don't want to make that assumption, but that's a good way to bring things up in advance is kind of reflect on the past, set expectations for this time around, talk about consequences before so they're aware of it, and be
Right.
as transparent, empathetic, and regulated as you can possibly be to
Mhm.
model that behavior.
Yeah, and that is hard, like you're saying, right? Easy for me to say. And
Yeah.
more often than not, it is trying to resolve what to do after the fact with something. But part of the
Hmm.
transparency is, okay, we haven't dealt with this before. We haven't dealt with the situation where you're on the phone too much or you've downloaded this app that we asked you not to, right? So rather than feeling like you have to have the perfect answer as the parent, being transparent about that of, okay, now this, we want you to still have freedom. We need to have rules for you. So what do you think is fair? Taking their feelings into account. How are you feeling about this? And really considering that. And then ultimately, okay, so this is the decision that we're making. This is how we're adjusting. And it's to help you have as much, freedom as is appropriate, not to punish you for something that was, new to all of us, or
Yeah.
that was a mistake. It's
Yeah.
understandable parents get scared,
For sure.
reactive. So it's, yeah, not expecting yourself to have that answer. And if
Yeah.
you need a whole regroup, I think that's where I come in. Because again, sometimes there's already been, trying to convince and stuff. It's hard.
Yeah. Yeah.
So having another person kind of create the agreement as like the third party can be helpful too. Don't feel like
Yeah.
you have to have it perfectly figured out already as a parent.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's emotional. And so I think that's also a huge disconnect oftentimes is the parents have their emotions about it, the teen has their own emotions about it. Sometimes that can either shut one or the other down completely, so you're not able to communicate what your truth is and what your then the other person can't hear and understand. So it is so helpful to have a moderator and have almost like the translator, the therapist translator for what's happening because I mean, it's human nature to shut down or to not have the right thing to say when we're emotional, when we're angry, frustrated, activated. It's not going to come out in the most eloquent way. And so it's very helpful to have someone help process and then figure out a way to communicate it where the message being sent is the same as the message being received. There's no misinterpretation happening. So it's a lot, it's complicated. And so I think you and I both, working with teens, we really empathize with the teen, with the parent, and really want to just validate that it's a lot more complicated than just as simple as it sounds like, oh, we'll communicate and talk ahead of time. And there's so much that goes into all of that.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, the role as the parent has, you have to wear a lot of hats, being the manager of the whole conversation, being aware of your own needs and feelings and boundaries, being, somewhat responsible for your teenagers, trying to navigate all of the circumstances that come up in their life, trying to navigate trust. It is a lot. So being supported in that role and having a space just to not have to be perfect at it and feel your feelings about it too, to then
Yeah.
collaborate is
Yeah.
important.
Do you like, just one last thing before we wrap up, do you like parents to collaborate with the teens around what consequences might look like? Or do you think that that is something better to have it be a removed kind
Mm.
of conversation between the parents themselves?
Yeah, it's most important for parents to be on the same page. I always, like to see it as teenagers being able to give their input, because when they feel that their feelings and perspective has been heard, they're more likely to have buy-in, and they have to in some ways agree to whatever it is. They don't get the final say, but as much as
Yeah,
possible to collaborate is great. So getting their
yeah,
input for, again, certainly for high school more so.
yeah.
I think for younger, it's more likely that having, a couple of options. Do you think this is fair, that is fair,
Mm-hmm.
um,
Hmm.
for them to choose between, or uh,
Yeah,
something like that, rather than feeling like they have to come up with all of it themselves.
yeah,
As long as, again, that's just including their input, not outsourcing that, um, to them or making them responsible for setting it up. But
yeah,
yeah, asking them to consider what's fair, I think, is a part of helping them grow up and see the impact of their own choices.
yeah. I agree. I definitely love the idea of options because then it doesn't, again, it doesn't feel so punitive. It's
Hmm.
really just kind of like, okay, this is what my parents are seeing as a valid response to whatever happened. Let me process this range of options and how that will affect me in my life. So, yeah, it's a tricky thing to navigate.
Yeah.
Any final tips for parents this holiday season? What should they kind of try to be mindful of or look out for?
Hmm. Yeah. I mean, I like to just say, I mean, as far as a tip, just to kind of notice the small moments, not feeling like you have to fix everything overnight or create some big thing or make sure everybody's happy and everything's going perfectly well, but just to try to have some small intentional moments of connecting with your teenager, and um, trying to look at that as something that's valuable to both of you. Yeah, and I think the main thing to look out for is unspoken expectations. Just
Yeah.
thinking about what feels important to you and really either asking for it or clearly expecting it, or that it, it would feel good to consider and ask. You might be surprised by what your teenager is looking forward to or is wanting from the holiday season as well.
Yeah, that's great. Manage your own expectations and then also be aware of the unspoken expectations of others.
Right.
Awesome. Well, how can people find you if they want to know more about you and your work?
Yeah, my website's Kristine Therapy LA. So you can contact me there. Got
Awesome.
some other things I'm putting together now, a new updated blog and bit of resources that I'm putting together called Humor and Healing, but that's not launched yet, but it will be soon. Just a place to
Awesome.
get, some tips and encouragement for parents, things like that. But yeah, just through my website, Kristine Therapy LA.
Okay, wonderful. Well, thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it,
Yeah,
and I hope you have a great holiday.
you too. Thanks, Ilona. Thanks for doing this.
Absolutely.